We're now on part two of the Enlightenment. We talked about the various political philosophers. How did all these ideas spread, you might ask? Well, at that time, people would throw these very elaborate dinner parties. Mostly women held this role of inviting all these intellectuals together. They were known as salons. So, salons were gatherings of intellectuals, and everybody who had some kind of expertise were supposed to stand up and enlighten everybody about their topic, whether it was medicine or genetics or political philosophy or religion. It could be anything, really, whatever you felt well versed on or whatever you could talk about eloquently. So these salons were kind of like gatherings of intellectuals. One Frenchman by the name of Denis Diderot was like, man, this is good stuff. We need to let everybody hear, not just the people who are sitting in this salon. So he began to ask people to write some of the stuff down, and he would publish it in what became the first encyclopedia. So an encyclopedia was kind of a collection of wisdom, a collection of different facts, and that was really important. Now, early on in this time period, Baroque was the art form. Baroque is known as very ornate, very showy. You can always tell something Baroque with the elaborate carvings in, say, a church, or the music's very showy, the art. That was at the beginning of this time period. Eventually, though, you started to see neoclassical. Neo means new, and classical kind of means old. It's almost like an oxymoron. But what they're talking about here is getting back to kind of the strict beauty of Rome or Greece. And you see that a lot in the architecture, for instance, in this building here, or even in the United States Congress or White House. The design is very neoclassical. You see this a lot in music. I mean, when you think of classical, you probably think of music. And I'm going to hit two of the most famous ever. One was Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Mozart was a musical genius and composer who often kind of intersected different melodies and lines in his work. Another Austrian by the name of Ludwig van Beethoven was even more famous. He would compose not only so many different works, but he's most known for his operas. I'm sure you've heard his 1812 Overture or many of the others. You would recognize some of their work if you heard it. Not only was great classical music being composed and performed throughout Europe, but it was also the rise of the novel, kind of like the adventure stories. One famous British man by the name of Daniel Defoe would write Robinson Crusoe. Robinson Crusoe is a fictional account of a man who kind of gets lost on a deserted island and left there. It's actually taken after somebody it really happened to, but it's a pretty famous novel. So the novel came about. Then you had these enlightened despots. Again, that's another kind of oxymoron. They're enlightened, but they're a despot. A despot is somebody who keeps firm control. I'll give you three of them. The first is Frederick the Great of Prussia. We've talked about Frederick. Frederick flirted a lot with the Enlightenment. For instance, he brought in the potato to help the poor people. He had public education. These are all enlightened ideas. But Frederick didn't really share power. He didn't believe in like the political forms that were pretty popular about that time. Similarly, Joseph II of Austria, he maintained total control, but he allowed certain forms of religious freedom in Austria. Catherine the Great was another one of Russia. She even liked legal reform and tried to institute them. But after the French Revolution turned radical, she began pulling back from some of the reforms she tried to make and became more of a pure despot. So enlightened despots basically trying to institute some ideas of the Enlightenment, but that doesn't mean they're going to give up or share power, and they rarely ever did. Then you have the American Revolution. I mean, how much do you know about our history? It really begins, well, I mean, I could go way back, but George III was King of England. And George was kind of a despot in that he had certain views on his possessions, and America was one of his big possessions. After the French and Indian War, which is internationally known as the 7 Years' War, um, George was in debt, and he felt, who better to pay this debt than my colonies, because I incurred this debt fighting to keep them free of the French and Indians. So he began to pass a variety of money-raising taxes. Eventually, the big one was the Stamp Act. Well, you might know the story of the Boston Tea Party. And so a lot of times, many colonists refused to pay it. So George got upset with the colonists and he began to pass what were called the Navigation Acts, which really restricted American trade with the lucrative West Indies, what we now know as the Caribbean islands. But more importantly, it began to shut down the port of Boston because they were the ones that dumped the tea in the harbor. So the United States, well, they were colonies, the United Colonies at that time. They were upset with more than that. George also tried to restrict the settlement of the colonists west of the Allegheny Mountains, pretty much the Appalachian Trail. So you couldn't settle in, for instance, western Pennsylvania or Ohio or Tennessee or Kentucky. And that was off limits to these poor people who wanted free land for themselves. So eventually the Declaration of Independence was declared. Thomas Jefferson would be the writer of the Declaration of Independence, but he was not the sole author, meaning other people had input. At first, they were trying to call on George to kind of, address their grievances, but George wasn't going to compromise, and that's why they felt like independence was important. It took many years. I mean, the Declaration of Independence was 1776, and we really don't get our independence until the early 1780s. The Battle of Yorktown over in Virginia, which is only about 2.5 hours from here. We needed the French to bottle up the British, and then George Washington and Alexander Hamilton and the French managed to force General Lord Cornwallis to surrender. Our first form of government was known as the Articles of Confederation. We didn't really have a strong president. Each state held its own power and was jealous of its own power. So Maryland had its own rules, and you go over the river into Virginia, their rules were different. And they couldn't raise armies, which the Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts, they had trouble putting it down. So eventually, they began calling people together in Annapolis to kind of deal with revising the articles because of how weak they were. They finally decided, you know what, we need to junk the articles altogether and come up with the U.S. Constitution, which is based on the idea of federalism. Federalism is a division of power between a strong national government and states, meaning the federal government has most rights, but the state also have their own rights. For instance, when you can get your driver's license. In some states it's 15, some it's 16, some of it's even 17 or 18. Now, a lot of the people, like Thomas Jefferson, didn't want to see too strong of a national government because he thought it would step on individual rights. So the Hamiltonians, those who wanted a strong national government, decided to kind of make the others get on board. They would pass the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights are the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. What they do is basically guarantee your individual freedoms. Your First Amendment, your rights, your individual rights, your Second Amendment, Fourth Amendment, search and seizure, and so on and so forth. So the Bill of Rights guarantee your individual freedoms. They were passed in order that those who only wanted, individual state rights would get on board with a stronger federalist system that our founding fathers created. All right. We'll stop there. We'll pick up the French Revolution.